The great army waited on the edge of the frontier as the last warm winds of early summer drifted across the plains. Men adjusted their shakos, tightened their cloaks, and listened to the distant clatter of wagons gathering into formation. Horses snorted in long, steaming breaths, stamping the ground as if sensing the weight of the campaign ahead. Officers rode between the columns with rehearsed calmness, their polished boots catching the fading gold of the evening sun, while younger conscripts tried to steady their hands, still believing glory followed the rhythm of drums. The air held a sweetness, the smell of cut grass, dust and leather, that made the coming march feel almost gentle. Campfires flickered in soft orange pools, casting shadows that swayed like dancers across knapsacks and rifles stacked in neat rows. Above it all, the imperial banners stirred lazily, their edges brushing the wind with a confidence that felt absolute. No one spoke of fear. No one imagined that nature itself could turn against an army so vast. For now, everything looked possible. For now, the world appeared calm, wide open, and waiting to be conquered. The Grande Armée, in those early days, resembled a living organism, tight, disciplined, and humming with purpose. Veterans swapped stories of Austerlitz and Jena, promising that the new campaign would be another swift triumph, while young recruits leaned closer, their eyes reflecting the firelight as though victory were already painted across the horizon. Drummers rehearsed steady beats that rolled across the fields like a heartbeat, uniting tens of thousands under one rhythm. Quartermasters shouted orders over creaking wheels, pushing supply carts overloaded with hopes of a rapid advance. Even the air carried a certain warmth, the kind that softened iron and made armour feel less heavy on the shoulders. In the distance, farmland spread in peaceful rows, untouched by conflict, deceivingly serene beneath a violet sky. Soldiers imagined warm beds awaiting them in foreign cities, imagined celebrations, imagined the swift collapse of any enemy foolish enough to resist. What none of them sensed, what no drumbeat could reveal, was how thin the line between triumph and disaster already was, how quietly the season would shift, how indifferent the land ahead would be to ambition. For now, the illusion of control still held, fragile and glowing like embers before the wind. Morning broke gently over the sprawling encampment, brushing the tops of tents with a pale ribbon of light. Smoke drifted upward from cooking fires, hanging low before slipping into the quiet blue of the early sky. Rows of soldiers prepared for the day's march with slow, practiced motions, tightening straps, checking flints, tucking letters from home deeper into their coats, as though those small papers held warmth. The smell of boiled grain, wet grass and horse sweat mingled into a heavy perfume that clung to every surface. As the sun climbed, columns stretched across the landscape like a great metal spine, bayonets catching light in glittering flashes. Conversations rose in soft bursts, jokes, predictions, reassurances, none loud enough to break the fragile calm that hovered over the army. It was the kind of morning that made war feel distant, almost theatrical, as if the hardships belonged to someone else in a story still unwritten. Even the officers, usually stern and clipped in their commands, seemed lighter in expression, carried by the belief that discipline and numbers alone could shape destiny. The march ahead felt long but not yet ominous, the world still warm enough to disguise what waited beyond the border. As preparations finalised, small signs of unease flickered through the confidence of the ranks, subtle, almost imperceptible details that only later would feel like warnings. A supply wagon cracked under its load, spilling sacks of flour onto the dirt. A farrier muttered curses as horseshoes shattered unexpectedly against stones hardened by an early chill. The map spread across the officers' tables shifted slightly in the wind, corners curling as if resisting the campaign's intent. Yet no one allowed these minor inconveniences to shadow the optimism that dominated the camp. The army was vast, seasoned and proud. Such scale seemed to promise protection against misfortune. Morning drills resumed with perfect form, drums echoing through the fields with crisp precision. Messengers galloped through narrow paths, their cloaks snapping behind them like banners caught in a storm. Each small disturbance was smoothed over with practiced discipline, folded away beneath layers of confidence. Still, in the quiet moments between commands, a few soldiers glanced toward the distant tree line, noticing how the leaves barely moved despite the breeze, an odd, motionless stillness that pressed against the senses. Something in the air felt watchful, but the march continued, unquestioned and unwavering. By the time the sun dipped toward the horizon, Long shadows stretched across the camp, pulling the warmth out of the ground with surprising speed. Soldiers gathered around fires, rubbing their hands together, surprised at how quickly the evening cooled despite the season's promise of lingering heat. The sky shifted from gold to a deep bruised purple, and the distant forest darkened until they resembled an unbroken wall. Stories of past glories carried through the camp in soft waves, warming the spirits of the younger men who clung to tales of swift victories and heroic charges. Above them, embers rose and flickered, dissolving into the night as though swallowed by something unseen. A few veterans grew quiet, sensing the peculiar bite in the air, a sharpness that didn't belong to summer, a cold whisper that seemed to seep from the very soil. They said nothing. Experience had taught them that nature often spoke long before battle did. And on that evening, as drums softened and the camp settled into an uneasy sleep, the first hint of Russia's breath drifted across the frontier. Not yet a threat, not yet a storm, just a reminder that the world beyond the border followed no empire's command. The march across the frontier began beneath a sky so wide and pale it seemed to swallow the horizon. As the columns advanced, the land changed with slow, unsettling consistency. Fields growing sparse, villages turning silent, and the familiar architecture of the West fading into rougher, more distant shapes. The road itself stretched like a dull ribbon across a countryside that offered neither welcome nor resistance, only an unbroken expanse of dust and scrub. Soldiers shifted beneath the weight of their packs, boots striking the ground in a steady rhythm that echoed across the emptiness. The further they moved, the more the environment felt unwilling to answer back. No laughter from farmyards, no clang of distant tools, no movement behind shuttered windows. Even the animals grew tense, horses lifting their heads at every stray sound as though listening for footsteps that never appeared. The silence was not peaceful. It pressed inward, heavy and unspoken. The Grande Armée entered Russian territory expecting resistance, yet found only stillness. And in that vast, quiet stretch of land, the campaign began to feel less like a march toward battle, and more like a journey into a world that had already prepared itself to resist in silence. As the days stretched on, distance itself became an adversary. Dust clung to uniforms in thick layers, turning blue coats into muted earth-coloured shades. Wagon wheels groaned under the strain, their iron rims striking the hardened road with a hollow metallic thud that repeated endlessly through the line. Horses sweated beneath the heat, their flanks streaked with foam, while soldiers wiped sunburnt faces and pulled canteens close to their lips, only to discover how quickly water disappeared under the relentless march. The monotony of the path blurred time. Each village they encountered looked abandoned, every well dry, every orchard stripped long before their arrival. Fires had burned in some homes, leaving blackened beams where warmth once lived. The men spoke less as fatigue deepened, replaced by the creak of leather straps, the jingle of equipment, and the rhythmic tramp of thousands of boots moving in mechanical unison. The land unfolded wider, flatter, more indifferent with every mile. Here, in the depths of Russian space, ambition met a different kind of resistance. Not armies, not gunfire, but a vast silence that absorbed sound and promise in equal measure. Yet even as exhaustion settled over the ranks, officers continued to insist that progress was steady, that each step forward tightened the noose around the Russian retreat. Soldiers clung to this belief, telling themselves that the deserted villages were merely signs of an enemy too frightened to stand and fight. In the evenings, when the sun dropped behind the plains and washed the sky in copper hues, small fires flickered across the campsites in thin, scattered lines. Men huddled around the flames, chewing hard bread and whispering that victory must be close now. After all, no army could keep running forever. But in the darkness beyond their fires, the land remained empty. No distant farm lights, no barking of dogs, no silhouettes moving through fields. It was as if the road ahead was absorbing life as quickly as they advanced, swallowing all evidence of human presence. And though the men still repeated confident predictions, those words began to sound more like reassurances meant for themselves, rather than declarations of certainty. The march continued, but beneath the familiar songs and discipline, uncertainty seeped quietly into the rhythm of the army. Unease sharpened when the supplies began to thin. Foraging parties returned with little more than wilted vegetables or a few frightened chickens, the kind of food meant for a handful of men, not for an army stretching further than the eye could see. Reports surfaced of empty barns, stripped granaries, and wells filled with debris to make them useless. The Russians had removed everything, leaving only the faint scent of smoke and abandoned earth behind them. Maps, once drawn with confident lines, now proved unreliable. Roads curved in unexpected ways, streams dried into empty beds, and villages appeared miles away from where they were marked. Officers argued quietly among themselves while rank-and-file soldiers traded uneasy glances, noticing how quick the nights grew colder and how slow the rations were becoming. Still, no enemy confronted them. The Russian army hovered somewhere ahead, unseen but undeniably in control, guiding the French deeper into a landscape prepared for starvation. The confidence of earlier weeks began to erode, replaced by a silent, creeping recognition that the emptiness surrounding them was not accidental. It was deliberate. As the Grande Armée pushed farther east, the scale of its own vulnerability became clearer. From the crest of a low ridge, the view stretched outward in an enormous sweep. Endless columns of infantry, artillery teams struggling with tired horses, wagon trains dragging themselves along the dusty path. From a distance, the army looked powerful, an immense organism crawling across the land in perfect formation, but up close, cracks showed. Coats hung loosely on thinner bodies. Boots wore down faster than replacements arrived. Men walked with a subtle limp that became more pronounced with each mile. When the wind picked up, it carried dust into eyes and mouths, turning every breath into a dry scrape. The officers still rode tall, repeating the familiar reassurances, yet their voices carried less conviction. The landscape ahead offered no change, just more plains, more distance, more unseen miles waiting to consume them. As the sun lowered once again, stretching shadows across the weary ranks, a quiet dread settled in. This campaign was no ordinary march. It was a journey into a land that absorbed armies, swallowed supplies, and answered ambition with silence. The French had expected resistance. Instead, they found a vast emptiness that felt increasingly like a trap. When the first distant glimpse of Moscow finally appeared on the horizon, it arrived not as a triumphant sight, but as something strangely muted by distance and exhaustion. The golden domes, once described in letters and rumours as glittering symbols of unimaginable wealth, shimmered faintly beneath a haze of drifting smoke. Soldiers lifted their heads with a mixture of hope and disbelief, their steps quickening at the idea of reaching shelter at last. After weeks of marching through empty plains and abandoned settlements, the shape of a great city rising from the far edge of the landscape felt like a promise. Warm roofs, stocked storerooms, and the stability of civilization. Officers rode along the front, calling for order, as if trying to restrain the mounting relief spreading through the exhausted ranks. Yet even from afar, the city looked strangely quiet. No movement along its walls, no crowds rushing to witness the arrival of the invaders, no sound of bells or markets or human life. Only a thin smear of smoke climbing into the late afternoon sky hinted that something inside those distant streets was already shifting, already burning. Moscow had been found, but not as the army had imagined. As the columns drew closer, the strangeness of the scene sharpened. The smell reached them first, not the scent of hearth fires or cooked meals, but the acrid bite of burning timber drifting across the wind. The gates stood open, unguarded, as if the city itself had stepped aside rather than resist. Streets that should have echoed with wagon wheels shouted orders, or panicked footsteps lay silent beneath a drifting layer of soot. Houses stood intact yet abandoned, their windows dark, doors swinging faintly on loose hinges. In some quarters, smoke curled steadily upward from ruined districts where entire blocks had been set alight. Soldiers moved cautiously into the city, boots crunching on broken glass, their voices lowered as though the empty buildings were listening. Grand mansions stood stripped of valuables. Markets were deserted, churches silent. Even the animals were gone. No horses, no dogs, not a single sign of hurried escape. It was as though Moscow had emptied itself intentionally, leaving behind only a shell, a ghost of the capital the French expected to conquer. Relief mingled with unease, for victory had arrived without resistance, and in war such quiet rarely meant safety. Deeper inside the city, the full extent of the abandonment revealed itself in unsettling detail. Mansions built with ornate facades stood lifeless, their grand entrances dusted with ash, their carved doors left ajar as though their owners had fled mid-breath. Fine furniture lay overturned in parlours lit only by the glow of distant fires, and shattered mirrors caught brief flashes of marching soldiers as they passed. In narrow streets, charred beams leaned against cracked stone walls, forming makeshift corridors of smoke and silence. Entire marketplaces, places that should have been dense with merchants, livestock and colour, lay eerily intact but stripped bare. Stalls still stood in neat rows, yet every barrel and basket had been emptied long before the French arrived. Even the echo of footfalls seemed muted, swallowed by a city that refused to respond. Some soldiers stooped to inspect small objects left behind. A child's toy abandoned on cobblestones, a pair of boots left neatly by a doorstep, a pot still warm enough to suggest a hurried departure. But no footprints remained. No voices drifted from alleys. Moscow felt like a stage after the actors had vanished, leaving only props smouldering beneath a smoky, unwelcoming sky. What struck the army most, however, was the absence of the comforts they expected to find after such a gruelling march. Many had imagined hot meals, beds, and the dense energy of a conquered capital, but the reality felt hollow. Food stores had been emptied or burned, cellars stripped of grain, and wineskins slashed open to spill their contents into the dirt floors. In the wealthier districts, silk curtains dangled half-burned from tall windows, and chandeliers lay shattered across marble floors. Instead of warmth, men found cold hearths and broken furniture. Instead of rest, they found the heavy work of scavenging through ruins for anything remotely useful. Some soldiers attempted to settle into the houses, lighting small fires and barricading doors, but the silence made the rooms feel cavernous, as though the city itself resented their presence. Smoke drifting through cracked roofs clung to their throats, adding bitterness to every breath. For all its size and grandeur, Moscow offered nothing but shelter without comfort, a hollow prize. The illusion of triumph dissolved quickly as the men realized that the city held no celebration, no surrendering citizens, and no stability to cushion their exhaustion. They had taken a city, yet gained almost nothing. By nightfall, the first sense of entrapment began to seep through the ranks. Fires flared across distant districts, casting long red reflections against the domes and spires that loomed over the city's empty streets. Officers attempted to organise quarters and establish some semblance of order, but disorder spread faster than their instructions. Frustrated soldiers cracked open sealed doors, searching for food or warmth, while others wandered the boulevards with hollow eyes, unable to reconcile the dream of Moscow with the wreckage around them. The silence that had seemed merely strange upon arrival now grew oppressive, pressing against the walls of every structure as though the city itself were holding its breath. Rumours circulated. Some claimed the Russians had burned their own capital intentionally. Others whispered of traps hidden within the ruins. Whether true or not, the effect was the same. Unease took root. The longer the army stayed, the more Moscow felt less like a conquered jewel, and more like a quiet, smouldering labyrinth designed to swallow them whole. Victory had not come with celebration. It had arrived as a warning disguised as shelter. And though the fires still burned, the warmth they offered held no comfort, only foreboding. The change in weather announced itself without ceremony. One morning, as soldiers stepped into the streets to begin their routines, a sharper breath clung to the air, thin, cutting, unfamiliar. The warmth that had lingered through the march and into the early days in Moscow had vanished overnight, replaced by a cold that seemed to seep directly through cloth and bone. Frost formed in delicate patterns along the edges of window panes, catching the faint sunlight in brief moments of beauty before melting beneath the troops' footsteps. But the cold did not soften. It thickened through the day, settling into every open space, tightening around the city like an invisible vice. Soldiers rubbed their hands vigorously, surprised by how quickly numbness crept into their fingers. Officers walked stiffly, feeling the bite of the air beneath their coats. Even the horses shuddered, steam rising from their flanks as their breaths turned to white clouds. The first dusting of snow drifted down by afternoon, light, almost gentle, but it carried a warning that no one yet understood. Winter had begun to stretch its fingers toward the army, and the land around them seemed to welcome the change with silent, merciless patience. The Grande Armée had entered Russia with uniforms suited for swift summer victories, not for the creeping chill that now tightened around Moscow. Coats that once felt durable suddenly revealed their inadequacies. The fabric, thinned by weeks of use, offered little defence against the sharpening cold. Many soldiers had no gloves, their bare hands turning red and stiff as they struggled to handle weapons or buckle straps. Boots began to betray their seams, leather cracking where it had been softened by heat and long marches. The contrast between expectation and reality deepened with every passing hour. Men gathered around small fires, pushing closer to the flames than safety allowed, desperate for warmth that vanished the moment they stepped away. Some tore strips from spare shirts to wrap around their fingers, while others stuffed dry straw into their boots in a futile attempt to insulate against the freezing ground. The city's stone walls, once imagined as protective, now trapped the cold inside their courtyards, turning every alley into a funnel of icy wind. The soldiers had envisioned rest, comfort, and recovery within Moscow. Instead, they found that the city offered shelter without warmth, walls without mercy, and no escape from the oncoming winter. As the cold deepened, the daily routines of the army began to unravel. What had once been simple tasks, lighting fires, packing gear, preparing rations, now required numbed fingers to perform actions they could barely feel. Wet wool stiffened into icy shells, freezing solid if left unworn for even an hour. Muskets chilled so quickly that metal seared exposed skin on contact, leaving small burns that stung beneath the harsh air. Cooking pots cracked when set directly onto flames, weakened by the abrupt shift between freezing temperatures and sudden heat. Even speech changed. Men spoke less, not out of discipline, but because each breath released a cloud of vapour that froze onto their scarves and collars, weighing them down. The cold did not merely settle around the soldiers, it altered the very shape of their days, turning every moment into a negotiation against discomfort. Fires struggled to stay lit in the wind, and those who tended them sometimes found the wood too frozen to ignite without breaking it into splinters. The city's long stone avenues became channels for icy gusts that cut through ranks like invisible blades. With each sunrise, the chill sharpened further, eroding strength with a relentlessness no battle had ever matched. Horses suffered first. Once strong, spirited animals, they now moved with unsteady legs, their hooves slipping on frozen cobblestones. Their coats lost their shine beneath a crust of frost, and their breaths formed thick clouds that lingered in the air before dissolving into the growing cold. Many collapsed in the streets, unable to rise again, their bodies stiffening far too quickly. Supply wagons fared no better. Wheels froze to the ground each night, requiring entire teams of men to break them loose at dawn. Ice formed around the axles, locking them in place until hammered apart with the blunt ends of muskets. The army depended on these animals and wagons for food, ammunition and equipment, yet one by one they failed, turning Moscow into a graveyard of abandoned gear. Soldiers tried to salvage what they could, carrying loads meant for horses on their own aching shoulders, but the effort only added to their exhaustion. The grand machinery of war, so impressive on the march, began to fracture piece by piece. For every cart lost, for every horse that fell, the army's lifeline shortened. Winter had not even reached its full strength, yet it was already dismantling the invasion with quiet efficiency. Despite the growing desperation, many soldiers clung to the hope that the cold would break, that a sudden shift in wind or a burst of warmth might ease their suffering. They watched the horizon for signs of change, convincing themselves that this chill was only temporary, but nature offered no reassurance. Each day brought a deeper frost, each night a sharper wind that slipped beneath blankets and layered coats with equal indifference. Fires that once seemed bright now appeared weak, their flames flickering helplessly against the vast, consuming winter. The sharp crack of ice echoed through the empty streets, and rooftops glistened under thin sheets of frost that grew thicker with every sunrise. The cold had settled into Moscow not as a passing guest, but as a sovereign presence, unyielding, absolute. Soldiers wrapped themselves tighter, moving more slowly, their breath clouding the air in brief ghostly shapes. A sense of foreboding grew quietly among the ranks. The realization spread, spoken in murmurs or shared glances. The fight ahead would not be against armies or generals, but against the winter itself. And this enemy, unlike any they had faced before, would not retreat. Hunger crept into the camp with a persistence even the cold could not match. At first, it was only an inconvenience, a missed meal here, a reduced ration there, but it soon grew into a constant pressure, settling behind every thought and tightening around every conversation. Soldiers searched their pockets for forgotten crumbs, chewed hard crusts that had survived the march and eyed the dwindling sacks of flour with rising worry. Hunger became a presence, something that moved among the men like an unseen companion. It listened to their whispered complaints at night and sat beside them during the day, patient and unhurried. Meagre fires burned beneath iron pots that held little more than melted snow, thin broth, or scraps torn from whatever could be found. The sweet, familiar smell of cooked meals never returned. Instead, the air filled with the sharp metallic scent of boiling water and the earthy bitterness of roots dug from frozen soil. Men who had once laughed over generous rations now measured each mouthful with silent calculation. Even the officers felt the growing emptiness, though they hid it behind stern expressions. Hunger did not discriminate. It hollowed every man in equal measure. Foraging parties, once confident in their ability to uncover supplies, began returning with almost nothing. Frozen fields yielded only withered plants, their leaves brittle and tasteless. Abandoned huts offered little more than ashes in old fireplaces and broken tools left behind by families who had fled long before. Sometimes a group returned triumphantly with a handful of potatoes buried deep in the earth, cold, hard, and barely edible even after boiling. Others found the carcass of a long-dead animal, stiff as stone in the frost, its meat needing to be hacked away with axes before it could be cooked. The men forced themselves to eat whatever they brought back, their faces twisting between desperation and disgust. Smoke from these meagre meals drifted weakly through the frigid air, carrying no comfort, only the reminder of how little remained. The landscape itself seemed determined to starve them, offering neither game nor grain, neither warmth nor shelter. Every step outside the city's ruins became a gamble, a search for food that rarely rewarded the effort. As the reports of empty cellars and barren fields accumulated, an unspoken truth tightened among the ranks. Survival would depend not on strategy or discipline, but on endurance. The cold soon worked its way beneath clothing and into flesh, sharpening hunger into something far more punishing. Frostbite emerged first as a tingling sensation in the toes, a faint numbness ignored during the day's march but impossible to dismiss at night. Within days, the tingling turned into burning pain and then into a frightening absence of all feeling. Fingers stiffened, turning clumsy and unreliable, making even the simplest tasks, tying a strap, loading a musket, striking flint, painfully slow. Some soldiers found dark patches forming on their skin, small at first, then spreading as if ink were soaking into the flesh. Men wrapped their hands in strips of torn shirts, pressed them against warm stones or buried them under blankets, but nothing stopped the cold from creeping deeper. Boots, already worn thin, offered little protection. Many soldiers marched barefoot inside them, toes rigid and blackening. Each morning revealed new casualties, men whose feet had frozen overnight, unable to rise without help, others whose fingertips had cracked open, bleeding despite the icy air. The cold did not kill in dramatic strokes, it chipped away quietly, a finger, a toe, a patch of skin at a time. The army felt itself shrinking with every sunrise. Nightfall became a trial no less severe than battle. Fires burned low, starved by wet wood and the relentless wind that swept through alleys and courtyards. Tents, once a refuge, sagged beneath frost that thickened over their fabric, turning them into cold shells that trapped more chill than warmth. Men huddled together, sharing what little heat their bodies could produce, though even that comfort quickly faded as the temperature dropped. The darkness brought with it a heavy silence, broken only by the cracking of ice, as it spread along rooftops or the distant groan of collapsing beams in abandoned buildings. Some soldiers whispered prayers, others stared into the dying embers with hollow eyes, unable to think beyond the slow ache settling into their bones. Sleep, when it came, was shallow and restless. Many woke with stiff limbs and frozen breath clinging to their scarves. The city that had once promised shelter now felt like a maze of cold stone and dead air, a place where warmth had no foothold. Through the night the army endured, waiting for dawn not with hope, but with the weary resignation of men who expect no relief. Only another day of the same slow suffering. Over time, a grim realization settled over the camp. The army was no longer advancing, no longer conquering, no longer marching toward glory. It was simply trying to survive. The proud formations that had stretched across miles of road were now fragmented lines of weakened men, their movements sluggish and uncoordinated. A strange quiet replaced the once constant rhythm of boots and drums, Conversations dulled, laughter vanished, and even commands softened into hoarse murmurs. The cold shaped every hour, dictating how far the soldiers could walk, whether they could hold their weapons, and if they would see the next morning. Food shortages hollowed their faces, frostbite crippled their hands and feet, exhaustion pressed against them like a constant weight. And yet, despite the misery, they continued moving, slowly, stubbornly, as though momentum alone could carry them forward. Those who fell behind did so quietly, often without a sound, their bodies discovered only when the next group passed by. Little by little, the army transformed into a shadow of itself, a procession of figures wrapped in rags and frost, trudging through a landscape that gave nothing back. Survival had become the only victory still within reach, though even that seemed uncertain. As the retreat began, the roads out of Moscow transformed into corridors of death. Bodies lined the frozen path, some arranged beside the route where comrades had attempted a final act of dignity, others collapsed mid-stride, frozen in the very posture of their last movement. The cold preserved them with unsettling clarity. Faces stiffened in expressions of exhaustion or disbelief, hands still clutching muskets or scraps of cloth. Snow gathered over their forms in soft layers, masking the sharp edges of suffering beneath a white stillness. The army moved past these silent markers with a numb acceptance, each fallen soldier becoming part of the landscape rather than a separate tragedy. Even the horses, once symbols of strength and mobility, now lay rigid along the roadside, legs curled as if still trying to rise. Their frozen bodies stood like statues, casting long shadows over the trail as the sun hung low in the winter sky. No one had the strength to bury them. No one stopped to mourn. The march pressed onward, turning the road into a grim procession between two worlds, the living and the already claimed. Every step forward carried the weight of knowing that the line between them was thinning. Among the dead, the horses became the most haunting reminders of what had been lost. Their once powerful bodies now lay stiff beside shattered wagons, their hides turned pale beneath layers of frost. Many had served through years of campaigns, carrying men, supplies, and artillery across Europe, yet here they fell without ceremony, victims of a cold far more relentless than any enemy charge. Soldiers moved past them silently, some pausing only long enough to cut away small pieces of frozen meat in a final act of necessity. The animals, now rigid as carved monuments, dotted the landscape at regular intervals, turning the retreat route into a macabre trail of former strength reduced to stillness. Wagon wheels, frozen solid, remained upright beside their fallen teams, their iron rims encased in ice. Stray harnesses and snapped leather straps lay half buried in snow, swaying gently in the wind like remnants of a battle long finished. The army's lifeline, its transportation, its movement, its heartbeat, had fallen apart beside these beasts. Each horse they passed reminded the soldiers how deeply the winter had already cut into the army's core, leaving behind only the echo of what had once been a formidable force. The deeper the army pushed into the retreat, the more equipment littered the path behind them. Cannons abandoned where the wheels froze, caissons overturned in frost-hardened ruts, and ammunition chests left half open, as though the soldiers had simply run out of strength mid-task. Muskets lay scattered in the snow, their barrels coated in a thin layer of ice that rendered them useless. Knapsacks, shattered crates, bent bayonets, splintered wheels, every mile revealed another fragment of the army breaking apart. What had once been a disciplined force, organised and equipped with the precision of an empire, now shed its tools like a dying creature losing pieces of itself to the cold. Soldiers carried only what they could manage, discarding anything that slowed their pace. Blankets stiff with frost, boots beyond repair, ruined coats, all were abandoned in small heaps along the roadside, frozen in shapes that suggested the haste with which they had been dropped. These remnants told a wordless story of exhaustion and desperation, marking each stretch of road with the silent confession that survival now outweighed strategy. The machinery of war had become dead weight, and in the end the winter decided what stayed and what was left to rot in the snow. Sound changed too, losing the familiar cadence of marching feet and disciplined commands. The retreat became a bleak soundscape of muted suffering, the crunch of snow beneath worn soles, the hollow coughs of sick men, and the low groans of those who stumbled but managed to rise again. The wind carried faint, indistinguishable voices, as if the land itself murmured in response to the army's collapse. Every so often, a weak call for help drifted across the path, quickly swallowed by the vast quiet before anyone could answer. Metal clinked softly when muskets knocked against belt buckles, no longer carried with pride but with the lethargy of habit. In the distance, an occasional crack echoed, sometimes a tree limb frozen to breaking, sometimes something far more final. Fires burned rarely, their smoke thin and colourless, rising like fragile threads that vanished against the endless sky. The retreat unfolded under a silence punctuated only by suffering, the kind of quiet that weighed heavily on the chest. It was a silence that suggested not peace, but the gradual unravelling of an army too cold, too hungry, and too tired to recognise itself anymore. As the days dragged on, many soldiers entered a state beyond exhaustion, a dull, instinctive rhythm where the body marched while the mind drifted elsewhere. They no longer noticed the frozen scenery, or the endless white stretching around them. Faces blurred together, and time dissolved into an unbroken sequence of footsteps, each one heavier than the last. Some men walked with eyes half closed, guided only by the movement of the column ahead. Others stared straight ahead with vacant expressions, as if their thoughts had frozen along with their limbs. The cold numbed their senses until the world felt distant, muffled, unreal. They stumbled mechanically, unaware of how close they came to collapsing themselves. More than once a soldier would suddenly sink to his knees, not from injury or panic, but simply because his body refused another step. Those behind him would help if they could, but more often than not the column drifted past in grim acceptance. The retreat had become less a march and more a slow, sombre drift toward survival, or surrender to the cold. And as the line stretched thinner, the living moved like shadows, indifferent spectres wandering through a land that had already claimed far too many. The deeper the retreat carried the army into the open plains, the more the landscape itself seemed to shift into something predatory. Snow drifted gently at first, gathering in soft piles along the roadside, but as the daylight thinned, dark shapes began to move across the distant ridges. At first, soldiers mistook them for stray trees or wandering shadows cast by the shifting clouds. But as the column trudged forward, the figures resolved into mounted riders, lean silhouettes perched atop wiry horses, emerging from the whiteness as though carved out of the storm itself. These were Cossacks, the elusive force whispered about in letters and campfire rumours, known for striking fast and disappearing even faster. They did not rush the column immediately. Instead, they watched from afar, their outlines stark against the snow, drifting parallel to the French as if testing the edges of a wounded animal. Their presence stretched the air taut, sharpening every sound, every tremor in the wind. The French soldiers, exhausted and half frozen, tightened their grip on their muskets, aware that these distant riders needed neither numbers nor full daylight to inflict damage. The winter had weakened them. The Cossacks merely waited for the right moment to begin. When the attacks finally came, they arrived with startling speed. One moment the landscape lay silent and still, the next a flurry of motion broke across the snow as the Cossacks charged with fierce precision. Their small horses cut through drifts with effortless agility, hooves kicking up icy powder that glittered in the pale sun. Sabres flashed sharp and cold, slicing into the rear of the column where the weakest marched. The French, slowed by frostbitten limbs and exhaustion, struggled to react. Muskets misfired as frozen powder refused to ignite, and many rifles were too brittle to withstand the cold. Panic rippled through the ranks as men scrambled to protect themselves, slipping on ice, stumbling over abandoned gear. The Cossacks did not linger. They struck, withdrew, and struck again, vanishing into the snow before the French could mount a proper defence. Their voices, shouts mixed with the harsh call of the steppe, echoed across the frozen plains. Each assault left more bodies behind, more equipment stolen or shattered, more fear settling into the bones of an already broken army. These attacks were not meant to destroy in one blow. They were meant to carve away the retreat piece by piece, like wolves harrying a dying herd. The chaos of these sudden clashes spread quickly through the retreating column. Horses reared in terror, their hooves striking sparks against frozen stones as riders fought to control them. Men shouted warnings that dissolved into the wind, their voices raw from cold and fear. Those at the centre of the formation could only watch the distant flashes of steel and hear the muffled cries of comrades at the flanks. Some tried to form defensive lines, planting their bayonets in the snow, but the formations faltered almost immediately. The men were too weak, the ground too uneven, their reactions slowed by exhaustion. Smoke from hurried musket volleys blew sideways in thin streaks, offering little cover. The French artillery, once the pride of the army, stood useless. Horses dead, wheels frozen, gunpowder unreliable. Every attempt to return fire felt sluggish and disjointed, as though the army were fighting underwater. With each passing moment, the Cossacks' hit-and-run strikes carved deeper into the column's defences, scattering small groups and stripping away order. The French soldiers, once drilled into unwavering precision, now fought as isolated fragments, each man trying to survive a battle without structure, warmth, or hope of reinforcement. For the men caught in the violence, survival became a desperate calculation measured in breaths and heartbeats. Soldiers fired blindly into the swirling snow, praying that frozen powder might ignite even once. Others swung bayonets numbly, their hands barely able to grip the weapon as the cold gnawed at tendons and bone. The ground itself betrayed them, slick ice sending men sliding, snow swallowing their footing with each frantic movement. Some stumbled while trying to reload, fumbling with cartridges that cracked or fell from stiff, unfeeling fingers. Those who fell often struggled to rise again, the weight of their packs and the grip of the cold locking them into the earth as shadows swept past them. The Cossacks exploited every weakness, darting in to snatch abandoned rifles, cut loose prisoners, or strike down stragglers before disappearing into the white distance. Amid the confusion, discipline dissolved entirely. Soldiers who once marched in perfect lines now drifted in scattered clusters, each group trying to orient itself while the wind carried away their sense of direction. Fear was no longer a passing emotion. It became a steady, choking pressure that tightened with every charge. By the time the Cossacks withdrew once more into the drifting snow, the damage they left behind stretched far beyond the bodies on the ground. The attacks had not lasted long, yet their effect seeped through the column like a spreading frost. Horses lay wounded or dead, equipment stolen or shattered, and countless soldiers stood staring blankly into the white distance, unsure whether the silence that followed was safety or merely the pause before another strike. Even the officers, hardened by years of campaigns, struggled to steady their voices as they tried to regroup the scattered ranks. The truth settled over the army with unmistakable weight. The Cossacks did not need to defeat them outright. They needed only to harass, to exhaust, to wait. The winter would finish what their sabres began. As the wind lifted snow from the ground in swirling sheets, the column reformed with visible hesitation. Every man knew that the riders could return at any moment, emerging again from the vast white emptiness that surrounded them. The retreat, once driven by urgency, now moved under the shadow of constant threat. The winter was merciless, but the enemy hidden within it was even more patient. As the battered remnants of the Grande Armée approached the Berezina River, the sound of rushing water reached them long before the river itself came into view. At first it was faint, a low, steady murmur carried by the wind, yet it cut through the silence of the retreat like a reminder of the world's indifference to human suffering. When the soldiers finally staggered onto the riverbank, they found the Berezina swollen and churning, its surface a chaotic mix of broken ice and dark, freezing currents. There was no easy crossing. The far shore shimmered through drifting snow, lined with distant shapes that hinted at Russian forces preparing to close in. The French stood at the edge of the water, their breath rising in ragged clouds, realizing that the river was both obstacle and trap. The banks were steep, the mud frozen into jagged ridges, and the icy spray stung their faces as they surveyed the impossible task ahead. Engineers were called forward, their tools already numbed by days of cold, to attempt what seemed unthinkable, constructing bridges under artillery threat with scant materials against the relentless winter. The Berezina, indifferent and wild, waited to test whatever strength the army still possessed. The engineers worked with a desperate precision born not from discipline, but from necessity. Their hands shook violently as they lifted axes and hammers, striking frozen timber that splintered unpredictably under the cold. Each blow sent shards of ice and wood flying across the riverbank, mingling with the soldiers' breath and the drifting snow. Russian cannons roared from the distance, their thunder rolling over the ice and echoing through the valley, forcing the builders to duck behind makeshift shelters of wagons and broken planks. Still, the work continued. Timber beams were dragged forward by teams of exhausted men. their boots slipping on the icy ground as they pushed the heavy materials into place. Fires were lit solely to keep tools from freezing solid, though the flames barely held against the wind. The river snarled beneath them, swallowing fallen chunks of wood and sending them spinning into the dark current. Above, the sky hung low and grey, threatening more snow with every passing moment. By the time the first supports rose from the freezing water, fingers were bleeding through split gloves and faces were raw from the cold. Yet the engineers pressed on. The survival of the entire army hinged on their fragile, freezing work. When the bridge finally took shape, chaos surged through the French ranks like a breaking wave. The moment the first plank settled into place, soldiers rushed forward with frantic urgency, driven by the knowledge that Russian forces were tightening the noose behind them. The bridge swayed under the weight of the first crossing units, its wooden frame groaning as boots, hooves and wheels pressed down in a desperate stream. Horses slipped on the icy boards, their screams swallowed by the roar of the river below. Wagons lurched dangerously at the edges, threatening to topple into the water each time the flow shifted. Commanders shouted orders that vanished into the howl of wind and cannon fire. Musket shots crackled from the far bank as Russian skirmishers attempted to disrupt the crossing, bullets skimming over the water and splintering the fragile structure. Men pushed forward regardless, some crawling on hands and knees, others clutching the ropes along the sides to steady themselves. The air filled with the sharp smell of gunpowder, the cold sting of river spray, and the weight of thousands of lives pressing toward the uncertain salvation of the opposite shore. Every step onto the bridge felt like a gamble against collapse. The bridge soon became a battleground of panic and determination. Artillery shells crashed into the icy banks, sending showers of frozen mud and shattered timber across the crowd. The structure shook violently with every impact, forcing soldiers to cling to anything they could grasp: planks, ropes. The frozen coats of men pressed beside them. Some slipped between gaps in the boards, swallowed instantly by the black water, their cries muffled beneath the river's relentless churn. Others waded through the waist-deep shallows near the banks, dragging wounded comrades whose limbs had stiffened in the cold. Horses, terrified beyond control, reared and kicked, knocking men into the torrent or blocking the narrow path entirely. The sounds blended into a single overwhelming roar. Rushing water, shouting men, splintering wood, and the distant thunder of Russian guns. Amid the chaos, engineers scrambled along the bridge, hammering loose planks back into place, even as enemy fire rained down around them. They worked with frozen hands and bleeding fingers, determined to keep the structure standing for just a few moments longer. Every second held the weight of survival. If the bridge failed, the army would fall with it. When the final groups reached the far bank, the sight behind them was one of devastation. The bridge, battered beyond recognition, sagged under the strain of the last desperate crossings. Flames licked at broken wagons and shattered timbers along the river's edge, casting red reflections across the swirling water. Behind the French, the frozen valley echoed with the shouts of enemies closing in and the cries of those still trapped on the wrong side of the river. Some soldiers stood trembling on the steep embankment, staring back in disbelief at the chaos they had narrowly escaped. Others collapsed into the snow, their bodies shaking not from cold alone, but from the shock of survival. Officers tried to regroup the ranks, shouting orders that barely cut through the wind, but the exhausted men responded slowly, their eyes fixed on the collapsing structure that had carried them through death's grasp. As the final supports gave way, the bridge cracked and folded into the river, swallowed by the current in a spray of icy mist. The French knew then that there was no turning back. The river had closed behind them, leaving the wreckage as a grave for those who hadn't crossed. The retreat would continue, but the army that emerged on the far shore was forever changed. By the time the shattered remnants of the Grande Armée moved beyond the Berezina, they no longer resembled an army so much as a scattered procession of survivors. The long, disciplined columns that had once stretched proudly across the road were now reduced to thin, uneven lines of men wrapped in whatever scraps they could salvage. Their uniforms, once crisp blue with gleaming brass, had faded into a patchwork of rags, torn blankets, animal hides, and strips of fabric tied around frostbitten limbs. Faces were hollow, cheeks sunken beneath the strain of hunger and cold, eyes dulled by days of unbroken suffering. The sound of marching boots, once sharp and orderly, had softened to a sluggish shuffle, a rhythm dictated not by command but by exhaustion. Few spoke. Breath hung in the air like small ghosts, dissolving as the men trudged forward. The officers rode less now, many having lost their horses to the retreat, and those who remained moved on foot among their troops, indistinguishable except for tattered epaulets. The landscape ahead offered no comfort, only endless white plains and grey horizons that seemed to stretch without end. The army moved forward because stopping meant death, and momentum, however slow, had become their last defence against the cold. As the retreat continued, the cold burrowed deeper into the men's bodies, numbing their limbs until sensation faded into a faint, distant throb. Fingers felt like fragments of wood, feet no longer distinguished between ice, snow or frozen ground. Many soldiers walked with a strange detachment, unaware of the raw skin beneath their breeches or the frost gathering on their eyelashes. Their minds drifted in and out of clarity, slipping between brief bursts of awareness and long stretches of dull haze. Sounds reached them as if muffled through layers of cloth, orders, cries, the wind itself blending into a single indistinct murmur. Some men hallucinated, imagining flickers of warmth or the sound of familiar voices from home, only to find nothing but the unbroken whiteness around them. Others stared straight ahead, their eyes glazed, their steps mechanical, as though guided by sheer habit rather than conscious will. The cold did not simply attack the body, it unstitched the mind thread by thread until thoughts moved slowly and memories felt distant. The army marched on, but many within it were already drifting somewhere far away, walking in a world made of snow, silence and fading strength. Along the retreating route, the contrast between what the army had been and what it had become grew painfully clear. In the early days of the invasion, the men had marched with straight backs, polished bayonets, and the bright certainty of victory. Now those memories felt almost foreign, distant images belonging to another lifetime. The soldiers who trudged through the snow were thinner, slower, their faces hidden beneath scarves and frost. Their coats hung loosely, stitched and restitched with spare cloth, animal hide or scraps torn from abandoned wagons. No sense of formation remained. Men walked where their strength allowed, drifting across the frozen terrain in loose, uneven clusters. Some leaned on makeshift walking sticks carved from broken rifle stocks. Others tied strips of leather around their legs to keep failing boots from slipping off. Every mile forced them to shed a little more of who they once were. The discipline that had defined the Grande Armée, the precision, the pride, the unshakable confidence, had dissolved under the relentless pressure of winter. What remained was a threadbare procession of individuals bound together only by the fragile hope that a few more steps might lead them closer to safety. The war felt very far away now. Survival was all that remained. The landscape offered no mercy. Snow rolled across the plains in endless drifts, erasing the path behind them and blurring the horizon ahead. Grey skies pressed low, stealing the contrast from the world until everything — trees, fields, distant hills — merged into one vast expanse of white. The air itself seemed heavy, weighing down the men's chests with each breath. Wind lashed at exposed skin, slicing through layers of rags and cloth as though nothing stood between flesh and the winter's edge. Tracks disappeared within minutes, swallowed by fresh snowfall, leaving the column to navigate more by instinct than sight. Sometimes distant shapes appeared. A frozen orchard, a collapsed barn, the shadow of a long-abandoned village. But none offered shelter. The world had become a monochrome wilderness, indifferent and unchanging. Each step forward felt like walking deeper into a void, the kind of space where time stretched thin and direction lost meaning. The soldiers no longer scanned the horizon for enemies. They scanned it for anything that wasn't snow, anything that broke the monotony of white. But the plains remained empty. The winter had claimed the landscape completely, leaving only cold, silence, and the slow, dragging movement of the dying army. When the survivors finally crossed the threshold into friendly territory, there was no triumphant cheer, no sense of relief powerful enough to cut through the exhaustion in their bones. Many did not even recognize the moment. They simply continued walking until officers forced them to stop. Fires were lit, tents raised, and warm broth distributed, but the men moved as though waking from a long, terrifying dream. Some collapsed immediately, their bodies trembling violently as heat touched frozen limbs for the first time in weeks. Others stared blankly at the ground, unable to process the idea that they were no longer being hunted by cold, hunger, or the constant threat of ambush. The horses that remained were few and skeletal, barely able to stand even after being unburdened. Weapons were stacked silently, muskets clattering as they slipped from numb fingers. Only then did the scale of what had happened begin to settle over the camp. An army that had marched into Russia with grandeur had returned as scattered remnants, a shadow of its former self. The men were alive, but changed in ways that no warmth, no safety, and no victory could undo. The retreat was over, yet the memory of it would follow them for the rest of their lives. In the days that followed the retreat, warmth returned not as comfort, but as a shock. Inside the makeshift camp set up beyond the Russian frontier, soldiers were ushered toward fires and thick blankets, yet their bodies trembled violently as heat touched flesh that had forgotten sensation. Some wept without sound, tears freezing at the corners of their eyes before thawing again near the flames. Others simply stared into the firelight with a distant, hollow focus, unable to grasp the idea that the killing cold no longer pressed against their backs. Nurses and surviving medical officers moved quietly among them, offering cups of broth that men sipped in small, trembling mouthfuls. In the dim glow of evening lamps, the survivors looked less like soldiers and more like exhausted travellers waking from a nightmare they had walked through with open eyes. The crackle of burning wood replaced the howling wind, yet the sound did not soothe them. It merely reminded them of how quiet their suffering had been. Even in safety, their bodies flinched as though expecting the cold to strike again. The retreat had ended, but its grip had not yet loosened. It lingered in every shiver, every hesitant breath, every fragile movement toward recovery. Reflection settled slowly over the camp, arriving not as a single moment but as a series of quiet realizations. Men who once marched with unwavering pride now struggled to understand what remained of themselves after the winter's relentless assault. In hushed conversations near the fires, they spoke of home with a caution that betrayed their uncertainty. Uncertainty about how they would be received, and whether the people they once were still existed beneath the layers of frost and loss. Letters were drafted with shaking hands, words smudged by trembling fingers, as survivors attempted to describe an ordeal that felt impossible to explain. The officers, stripped of their horses and their former authority, walked among their men with subdued eyes, their commands softened into gentle instructions rather than rigid orders. In the calm that followed the retreat, the army did not celebrate. It simply breathed, as though learning again how to occupy a world not defined by hunger and cold. The grandeur of conquest, once the guiding force of their march into Russia, now seemed unbearably distant. What remained instead was a quiet, almost reverent gratitude for a warmth they could feel, food they could swallow, and a future that, against all odds, still existed. In the days that followed, the true scale of the army's transformation became unmistakable. What had once been the Grande Armée, a force whose very name had echoed across Europe, now existed only as fragments. Soldiers gathered around fires in small, uneven circles, their uniforms reduced to faded symbols of regiments that no longer truly existed. They spoke little of rank or glory. Those distinctions had been stripped away long before the river crossing. Instead, they shared simple stories, memories of warmer campaigns, of faces they feared they might never see again, of comrades who had fallen quietly in the snow. Officers, once surrounded by orderlies and aides, now attended to their own gear, mending what they could with trembling hands. Muskets were cleaned not for battle, but out of habit, the motions familiar and comforting. Around them, the camp hummed with subdued activity, pots simmering, boots thawing, blankets drying beside fires. Yet even in these moments of quiet routine, a heavy awareness lingered. The army that had marched into Russia no longer existed. What remained was a collection of survivors bound not by victory but by the memory of how close they had come to losing everything, including themselves. At night, when the wind softened and the fires burned low, many soldiers found themselves haunted by a different kind of cold, the lingering presence of winter etched into their minds. They dreamed of endless white plains, of frozen rivers, of comrades calling out from behind veils of snow. Some woke gasping, clutching blankets as though they were still fighting for warmth in the open fields. Others remained awake, staring at the canvas walls of their tents, listening to the crackle of firewood that reminded them of snapping ice. Even in safety, the winter clung to them. It hid in the stiffness of their fingers, the trembling of their steps, the distant look in their eyes when someone mentioned the march. The cold had shaped them, hollowed them, and written itself into their memories with a permanence they could not yet understand. In quiet whispers, some admitted that they feared warmth would never feel the same again, that every gentle breeze might carry a shadow of frost, every snowfall a reminder of the suffering they had endured. The winter had retreated behind them, but inside their minds it remained, silent, watchful, unforgettable. As the camp settled into a fragile rhythm of recovery, the finality of the retreat took shape in the collective stillness that hung over the survivors. No grand speeches were given, no triumphant banners raised. Instead, the end of the ordeal arrived with a quiet, almost reverent calm. The men ate slowly, savouring each bite as though rediscovering what it meant to nourish the body. They moved with care, relearning the simple privilege of warmth, rest, and unbroken sleep. Among them, there was gratitude, but it was tempered by the weight of memory. The retreat had carved a line between who they had been and who they were now. The soldiers understood that Russia had taken something from each of them, something no victory elsewhere could restore. And yet, in that stillness, a fragile strength began to form. Not the loud confidence of conquest, but the quiet resilience of men who had endured the unendurable. When they finally looked toward the road ahead, they did so not with eagerness, but with steady acceptance. The march would continue, as marches always do, but the shadow of the winter behind them would never fully fade. It had become part of their story, part of their very breath. If you made it this far, thank you for spending your time here. If you'd like to hear more quiet history like this, consider subscribing. Your support truly means a lot.